to record our Zoom sessions, and then after we record them, we'll post the Zoom sessions. So if you notice that we're not recording, you can always remind me to record. I just remembered and started right now. But those are probably your two best resources for answering the questions, although there will be some things that you'll have to find in the book. And there may even be some things that you will need to look up online. Usually if you're not going to be able to find them in the book or the notes or the Zoom, I will tell you that specifically. So now that you've had a little bit of time, are there any questions about the syllabus or anything that we discussed on Monday before we begin looking at the first set of notes? If you think of anything later, let me know, and we'll see if we can answer that then. But for now, we're going to go to screen sharing, and we're going to look at the notes. So we're going to be talking in the first chapter, chapter 19, about Darwin's theory of evolution. And before we actually get to Darwin, we're going to look at a little bit of the historical background about the idea of evolution. And remember, we talked way back in the first chapter that evolution is important because it explains two contradictory things about living organisms. It explains the unity of life, what all living organisms have in common, and it explains the diversity, the differences that we see. As we go through this section on evolution, we'll get that. But one way to think about the unity of life is all living organisms have DNA as their genetic material. All living organisms use ATP as a source of energy. There are a lot of other things we could list, but that's just two very basic examples. If we think about the diversity of life, one way to think about this is right now there are somewhere between 2 and 3 million different species that have been studied and classified. And notice these species are called extant species. And when we say extant, in a sense, this is the opposite of extinct. When we talk about extinct species, every individual of that species is dead, like Tyrannosaurus rex, despite all those Jurassic Park movies. Extant species, there are still some living individuals. So they're alive right now. So right now there are between 2 and 3 million extant species. It's estimated there's at least 30 million. There's simply a lot of them that we haven't studied and we haven't really categorized. Why? Well, first of all, we've just discovered some of them, but a second factor is if they don't affect human health or they don't affect the environment in an obvious way, a lot of times we just aren't that interested. So they're not studied until we realize they're important. Now notice that living organisms are grouped into 3 major categories called domains. One of the domains is bacteria. And you probably remember from Biology 105, bacteria have prokaryotic cells. And remember that prokaryotic cells are cells that lack a nucleus and lack membrane-bound organelles. So remember, membrane-bound organelles include things like the smooth and rough endoplasmic reticulum, vesicles, the Golgi apparatus, peroxisomes, lysosomes, chloroplasts, mitochondria, the central vacuole. Those are all examples of membrane-bound organelles. And in fact, the nucleus itself is a membrane-bound organelle. Remember that nuclear envelope, which is really 2 membranes surrounding the nucleus. There's another group called archaea. And archae, as a root word, means ancient. Archaeology is the study of ancient civilizations. And archaea are very similar to bacteria. They have prokaryotic cells, so their cells don't have a nucleus, they don't have membrane-bound organelles. But when we look at their metabolism, it turns out their metabolism is similar to eukaryotic cells. more similar than it is to prokaryotic cells. So for many years, archaea were actually grouped with bacteria. But in 1981, a professor down at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, actually, so not too far away, published a paper where he pointed out some of these metabolic differences and also some structural differences in the plasma membrane and other parts of the cell. And at that time, archaea became their own group. And finally, the third group is eukarya, or it's sometimes called eukaryota. And these types of living organisms have eukaryotic cells. And the main characteristics of eukaryotic cells is they have a nucleus and they have membrane-bound organelles. Now, keep in mind, they may only have a nucleus for part of their life. If we look at erythrocytes in the human body, red blood cells, erythrocytes have a nucleus when they're first produced, but by the time they get into your blood, erythrocytes lose their nucleus. They're actually produced in your bone marrow. So they have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles at some point during their life, but maybe not forever. So here's a diagram of what's sometimes called the tree of life. A lot of biologists argue, and this diagram is a pretty good example, that the tree of life is probably a little bit better thought of as a bush rather than a tree. So if we look down at the bottom in the center, there's this little line coming up. And this little line coming up represents the first cells, the primitive cells that gave rise to everything else through evolution. And notice that this first line coming up branches in two directions. One half of the circle goes to the left, one arc of the circle goes to the right. Notice the arc to the left forms the bacteria. And notice that there are a lot of subdivisions within the bacteria. We'll talk about some of these groups later when we discuss evolution. And also, we said we were going to talk about biodiversity when we talk about the bacteria. To the right, notice that this circular arc branches into two main groups. One group is the eukaryota and one group is the archaea. Now remember, the archaea is these organisms that have prokaryotic cells, but their metabolism is similar to eukaryotic organisms. And there are actually some differences between bacteria or eukaryotes. So there are a lot of different types of archaea, as we'll see later. There don't appear to be that many species. Now, of course, we've all heard of bacteria. Well, a lot of times we haven't really heard of archaea, but the eukaryotes are the organisms that we're most familiar with. And there are three main groups of eukaryotes: the plants, the animals, and the fungi. And these three groups of eukaryotes, the plants, the animals, and the fungi, are called kingdoms. Now notice under eukaryota, we also have some things over here called Rhizaria, Excavata, Glaucophyta. We have a lot of other groups. So we do have some things that aren't plants and animals and fungi. And if you had a biology class before, you might have talked about organisms called protists or protoctista, and all these other eukaryotic organisms. Everything that isn't a plant or an animal or a fungus is kind of lumped together in the protista. And again, with the archaea and bacteria and the protista and the plants and animals and fungi, these will be things that we'll talk about more when we discuss biodiversity, but we need to have at least a feel for the different types of living organisms as we think about evolution. Now, notice when we think about the kingdoms. So when we talk about the kingdoms, keep in mind, we're only talking about plants and animals and fungi. When we talk about kingdoms, what we see is that, notice, a kingdom is a subdivision of a domain. If we look at the eukaryota or the eukarya, just leaving out the OT as they're often called, there are three kingdoms: the plants, the animals, and the fungi. So this is a subdivision of the domain. Then we can take the kingdom and we can subdivide it into phyla. So if we're talking about animals, for instance, there is a phylum of animals called Porifera, and Porifera are the sponges. There's another phylum of animals called Cnidaria, which is things like jellyfish and coral. There's a phylum called Arthropoda, which is insects and crabs and spiders and centipedes and all sorts of things. Now you can take each phylum and you can break a phylum down into classes. So if we look at the phylum that humans are classified in, for instance, humans are classified in a phylum called Chordata. And Chordata all have a stiff rod running along their back. In the case of people and organisms that are related to us, that stiff rod develops into what we call our vertebrae, our backbone. But there are some chordata that don't have a backbone. So if we look at the chordata, one class of the chordata is reptilia, reptiles. Another class is amphibia, the amphibians, frogs and toads and salamanders. Another class is aves, the birds. And we're classified in the order Mammalia, mammals. And as we'll see later, there are different characteristics that distinguish each of these groups. For the mammals, if you go back to what you probably learned sometime back in grade school, that's a way that we can still distinguish mammals. Mammals have hair and they feed their young with milk from the mammary glands. But there are other more technical things that we can use to define a mammal, like certain holes that are found in the skull that nerves and blood vessels go through, how many of those holes there are. Now, if we take a class, so if we look at the class Mammalia, you can take a class and you can break it down or subdivide it into orders. So in the class Mammalia, there's an order called Cetacea. Cetacea is the whales and dolphins. There's an order called Rodentia, the rodents, mice, rats, beavers, capybaras, hamsters, gerbils, things like that. There's an order called Chiroptera, the bats. We're in an order called Primata. And of course, Primata, primary means first. You know, we came up with the naming system, so of course we're in the first order. Now you can take orders and you can break an order down into families. So if we look at an order, if we look at the Primata, there's a family of what are called Old World monkeys. And the Old World is monkeys that are found in Africa or Asia or Europe. Because keep in mind, this classification system was devised by Europeans, and the Old World is the areas of the world that they knew about. There's also a family of New World monkeys. New World monkeys are found in South America and Central America. Now, it turns out, not too surprisingly, I guess, that Old World monkeys are more closely related to each other than they are to New World monkeys. Because New World monkeys are in South America and Central America. They can kind of travel back and forth, but it's pretty difficult for them to travel to Africa or Europe or Asia, not counting the fact that people can now put them in a zoo. But on their own, that travel is pretty difficult. Now, people are in a family called Hominidae. And hominids are humans, are human-like organisms. So Hominidae is things that are like humans. Now you can take a family, and families can be divided into genera. So humans are classified in the genus Homo. Homo means human. Besides this, if we look at our family, there's a genus called Australopithecus, which means southern ape man. And some of the earliest fossils of human ancestors are classified in the genus Australopithecus. And finally, you can take a genus and you can divide a genus into different species. So our species is Homo sapiens. Sapiens means thinking. So, and notice when I said our genus was Homo and our species is Homo sapiens, we never say the species without the genus name. And this is because there are some species names that are used several times in different genera. So we have to have the genus to know for sure which one we're talking about. So if we look at this diagrammatically, kind of the upper category, and notice this is just talking about animals, but this would also apply to plants or fungi. But notice this doesn't apply to bacteria or to archaea or to protists. We'll talk about how we divide them up and classify them later. So the upper level is the domain. So if we think about human classification, humans are in the domain Eukarya. So remember what we said. All eukarya have eukaryotic cells, cells with a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. Now you could divide a domain like eukarya up into kingdoms: plants, animals, fungi. Notice the word that's in parentheses is the plural because there are one or two of these that have unusual plurals. So if we look at plants, there are certain characteristics that distinguish something to be a plant. They have chlorophyll A and B, among some other characteristics. But since plants are in the domain Eukarya, they also have eukaryotic cells. If we look at fungi, there are some characteristics that identify an organism as a fungus, but they still have eukaryotic cells because they're in the domain Eukarya. And the same thing applies to animals. There are characteristics that make something an animal, things like they develop from a blastula after the sperm fertilizes the egg. But since they're eukaryotic organisms, they do have eukaryotic cells. Now, if we divide a kingdom up into phyla, so we said there's a phylum of sponges, there's a phylum of jellyfish, there's a phylum that includes insects and spiders and centipedes and crabs, they're all in one phylum. All of these different phyla of animals still have whatever characteristics the animal kingdom has, and they still have whatever characteristics the Eukarya domain has. A lot of people say that, we usually put domain on top because it's the largest category. But a lot of people say, think of flipping this diagram upside down and think of this like a series of boxes that gradually get smaller. So the domain Eukarya contains these kingdoms. So everything that's in the kingdoms is also in Eukarya. And the same thing as we go down the line. Notice that the two levels of classification that have kind of unusual plurals are phylum and phyla. The plural has an A. And this is going to be true for a lot of words that we see that end in UM. The plural will end in A. Why? Well, because these are Latin-based words. And in Latin, the plural of words that end in UM is made by getting rid of the UM and adding an A. Similarly, the plural of genus is genera. And again, it's got that A ending. Notice species is kind of weird because one species is a species, lots of species are just species as well. Now, notice if we're talking about human classification, when you're writing human classification, if it's being typed, as in this example, the genus is always underlined. If you were handwriting it, the genus is italicized here. In handwriting, it would be underlined. Similarly, the genus and species are always underlined. Remember I said we don't talk about the species without including the genus. If you've already mentioned the genus, like I did here, Homo, you can put H period sapiens. But if you haven't mentioned it before, then you would have to write out Homo sapiens. But you never just say sapiens. It's always the genus followed by the species. So they're going to be italicized if we see them in print. If it's handwritten, they should be underlined. Now, the reason that we need to do this is we're going to be talking about evolution. So we need to at least kind of have a feel for this. Notice though, if we talk about this says the kingdom bacteria, this is a typo. So I'm going to change this, but change this on your notes. I'll repost this, but this should be the domain bacteria and the domain archaea. And the domain eukarya. So if we look at bacteria, if we look at archaea, and if we look at everything in eukarya that isn't a plant or an animal or a fungus, we don't use all these levels. We still use genus and species. That's used for every living organism. But the other level, the family, the order, the class, the phylum, the kingdom, those are only used for plants and animals and fungi. If we're talking about a bacteria, we can talk about its domain, we can talk about its genus and species, but we don't talk about its family. We do sometimes classify them into things that are just called groups or something like that, but we don't use the other levels. So if we think about how we might see this, notice that the largest organisms that have ever been discovered aren't things that you think they are. You might think it's a whale or a dinosaur, but the largest organisms that are ever discovered are actually molds. Some molds spread underground, and there's one mold that's found out in Oregon that covers over 2,000 acres. And it's over 2,400 years old. How do we know it's all one single organism? Well, because some years ago when biologists first learned a little bit about DNA and they started sampling the mushrooms, which are really the reproductive structures from this organism, when they started sampling the DNA of the mushrooms that were over a mile apart had exactly the same DNA. So that was how we discovered that was really all one organism. Now, how is it one organism? Well, something we'll talk about again in more detail later, but keep in mind is when we look at fungus, for a fungus, it's kind of like an iceberg. Most of a fungus is not visible. Most of a fungus, in this case, it's a fungus that grows on the earth, is under the earth. If you're looking at a fungus that grows on a tree, most of the fungus is inside the bark of the tree, or maybe even further in. If you're looking at a fungus that grows on a person, like athlete's foot or ringworm, most of the fungus is inside the human body. It's not on the outside. That's why if you look at any type of advertisement for medications to cure athlete's foot, they'll talk about the idea that they work inside your body, because if all you do is kill the part of athlete's foot that is on the surface of your toes, it'll be back again very quickly. So this is just kind of an introduction to different types of living organisms. Most of the time, when we talk about evolution, we're going to be talking about species. So we'll be talking about something like Homo sapiens or Armillaria osteoideae. So we want to keep this in mind. And a lot of times we won't even be talking about a species. We'll be talking about a subgroup of a species. So if we think about humans, all humans are Homo sapiens. All humans belong to one species. But instead of talking about all humans across the world, we sometimes talk about one population. We could talk about the population of humans in South Holland, or the population of humans in Lansing, or the population of humans in Harvey. But notice, this illustrates a problem. If you think about Lansing and South Holland and Harvey, they're right next to each other. And it would be very easy if I own a house in Lansing, all I have to do is sell that house, and I could buy a house in South Holland or in Harvey. So one of the problems we have with kind of putting people into a particular population is that people are very mobile. People can move around. So since people can move around, so a lot of people just consider the human population on the entire Earth as being one single population. So today, when we talk about evolution, we talk about something called Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, remember what we said back in chapter 1 in 105. In science, when we think of something as being a theory, this means that there's actually a lot of experimental evidence to support this idea. So we're almost positive it's right. Technically in science, we're never completely positive, but so when we say that the theory of evolution explains the unity and diversity of living organisms, we don't want to interpret that as meaning, oh, it's just a theory, so it's not necessarily correct. It almost certainly is correct. So let's look at some of the history of how living organisms got on the Earth before Darwin's theory of evolution came along. And keep in mind that we're mostly looking at European explanations for what happened. So we want to think about the European explanation for nature that was prevalent if we start looking around medieval times. And the European explanation that was most commonly accepted was something called natural theology. Now notice that if you think about the phrase natural theology, it's a combination of basically two ideas, nature and theology, which is more the study of religion. Today, we sometimes think that these two ideas are opposed, that science and religion are contradictory. But if you go back to medieval times, the idea of natural theology is that the study of nature shows how God's mind worked, because God was believed to be essentially like a person. So just like you probably had an English class at some time where you read a poem or you read a short story or a novel, and then you use that to kind of think about the author. People believed in the Middle Ages that one way to study God would be to study nature, because God had created nature. So it seemed very logical. Now, natural theology includes two main ideas. One of these ideas is related more to living things. One of these ideas is related more to the non-living part of the earth, the land that we live on, rocks, minerals, things like that. The idea that natural theology proposed about living organisms was called fixity of species. And this was the idea that, the way it's described in the book of Genesis, God had created all living organisms, and because God was perfect, living organisms were perfectly suited to their way of life. And since God had created them perfectly, they hadn't changed at all since the time described in the book of Genesis. One Englishman named William Paley used the analogy of finding a watch when you were taking a walk. He said, well, anybody who's sensible would realize that if you look at a watch is so well designed for its purpose that it couldn't just have been created by chance. There had to be a watchmaker. And so in this point of view, you could think of nature as being like a watch, and God is the watchmaker. So this is our explanation for the living part of the world around us. The non-living part of the world around us was described by something called catastrophism. And by looking at the different people whose lives are described in the Bible, people came to the conclusion that the earth was very young. There was actually one religious group that figured out, I'm not sure exactly how they did the math, because I don't think the Bible is that precise, but they figured that the earth had been created in 4004 BC. And they actually figured that it was created on like October 10th or 11th. I'm not sure how they could calculate down to the exact day because, as I say, I don't think the Bible's that precise about the different time frames. But since the earth was very young, if you think about the surface of the earth, if you think about Mount Everest, if you think about the Grand Canyon, if you think about different features, mountains, rivers, things like that, it was believed that since the earth was young, that all the things we see on the surface had to be shaped by geological catastrophes. So think of the flood that Noah survives in the Bible. But it wouldn't have to be a flood. These catastrophes could be earthquakes, or they could be hurricanes. But the surface of the earth hadn't been affected by very slow processes. Why hadn't the surface of the earth been affected by slow processes? Well, because the earth was relatively young. There simply hadn't been time for these slow processes to have an effect. So if we would look at medieval thought about nature in Europe, this was really kind of the prevailing thought. But there was a problem. As time went on, there started to be some things that happened that challenged this idea of natural theology. First was Europeans started to discover stone fossils. Now, stone figures. Stone figures are what we just call fossils today. But this was a problem. There were fossils of different types of rhinoceros and things like that that were discovered in England. And there weren't any rhinos in England. So why would there be rhinoceros bones found in England? And there were fossils found on land that were animals that normally lived in the ocean, shells of things like clams. So this started to propose kind of a logical problem. You know, if living organisms had always been the same, if living organisms were perfect, why didn't we still have rhinos in England? Maybe these clams could live on land. Why weren't they living on land anymore? So this was one challenge to the idea of natural theology. Geology studies started to provide another challenge. Because in geology, some of the scientists started measuring what happened, how hills got bigger, or how hills got smaller, depending on what was happening in the area. And what they found was the thing that was making hills smaller or larger weren't catastrophes. There was something called the deposition of sediments. You've all seen a stream or a river where the water is kind of muddy, or just something in a gutter in your neighborhood after it rains hard, and the water has a lot of soil with it. Well, at some point when the water slows down, if it's not moving very fast, all these soil particles drop out of the water. And this is the deposition of sediments. And what some geologists saw was that when sediments were deposited in an area over and over and over again, the area started to get larger. And similarly, there was a process called erosion, where if you have the wind blowing across an area, and you can probably have experienced this if you've ever been to a beach on a windy day. If you have the wind blowing over an area, it picks up small particles of soil and carries them away. If you've ever been to the beach on a really windy day, you can sometimes kind of feel the sand in the wind. And erosion tends to make an area smaller. But the problem is these are very slow processes. And they could be measured, but they're not something that builds up Mount Everest in a couple days or weeks. When we look at deposition of sediments, this is something that could make hills or mountains or any type of landform really taller, but it's only going to increase it by a fraction of an inch every year. So it can be measured, but it's a really slow process. Well, if the Earth is only a few thousand years old, how can we get mountains if they only grow an inch or two a year? And in fact, geologists proposed something called uniformitarianism. Kind of sounds to me like it should be a religion, but it's not. Uniformitarianism is the idea that the forces that are changing the Earth right now, so erosion, deposition of sediments, things like this that are very slow, gradual processes, these are the same forces that shape the Earth over a long time period. Well, if that was the case, if this is how you get Mount Everest, or if this is how you get the Grand Canyon, that's not going to happen in a few thousand years if the change is only an inch or two a year. So this suggests that the Earth has to be a lot older. It couldn't have been formed in 4004 BC. And finally, in European history, something called the Age of Enlightenment started. And one of the things that occurred during the Age of Enlightenment in Europe is that democratic movements began to challenge monarchies in many of the countries. Now, keep in mind, they're not necessarily things that we would consider to be very democratic. In a history class, you might have read about the signing of the Magna Carta in England. And the signing of the Magna Carta in England is often, described as being a step towards democracy. But keep in mind, what the Magna Carta really did was it said the king couldn't do certain things without consulting the nobles. It didn't give all the common everyday people like you and me a vote on anything. It just meant that instead of being only the king's prerogative, other nobles had some say in what were happening. But there were democratic movements in several of the European countries. In some cases, monarchies were overthrown, but in most cases, it was just a matter of spreading the power out. Why was this important, though? Well, if you go back, before the Middle Ages or during the Middle Ages in Europe, almost all the countries were ruled by monarchies. And, everyday people like you and me, we were peasants, we worked the field. And if you looked at the life of peasants, your ultimate ruler, if you live in England, is the King of England. And your father was also a peasant. The main difference is, the king was different in his time. The king was probably your king's father, because this was a hereditary title. Well, the overall effect of this age enlightenment is some of these long-term, some of these age-old ways of life began to disappear, or at least to change. Now, although this has nothing to do with biological evolution, it was still important. And it was important because when we looked at social change suggested that maybe there could be change in nature too. Now, the downside is when social change suggested you could have change in nature, a lot of people also interpreted this to mean, we usually consider a democracy to be progress over a monarchy where you don't get to vote for anything. But some people also carried this idea of progress over to changes in nature. And as we'll see when we talk about evolutionary ideas, evolution is about change, but it's not about progress. It's just about change. So we'll see what we mean by that later. So several people began to think about social change and began to apply this to living organisms. And one of the most influential was a Frenchman named Geoffrey Buffon. And in 1749, he published a book called Natural History. And notice that when he published his book, he kind of reinterpreted the Bible a little bit. What he said was God had created molds or plans for each type of animal. Now notice that Buffon, like other biologists at the time, was mostly interested in animals. He didn't really spend too much time worrying about plants. Now, when he said that God created molds or plans, think of this like if you ever had one of those creepy crawler sets when you were a little kid or something like that, where you had these molds that you put the plastic into, you put them into the little toy oven and baked them for a minute, and they came out looking like insects or dinosaurs or something, depending on which set you had. And he said, you know, all the different forms of an animal had been created by degeneration of the plan in different environments. So God had created a plan for a cat. This is his original plan. And this became domestic cats in one environment if they're living in your house. If they were in a different type of environment, it became lions. If it was in another type of environment, it became tigers. If it was in a different type of environment still, it could become cheetahs. So basically, Buffon said all these things were created from the same plan. So God makes the plan, God makes nature, and then God puts the plan out in nature. And depending on where that plan is, it becomes a domestic cat, it becomes a lion, a tiger, a cheetah, whatever. Now, Buffon even believed that this degeneration could be reversed by changing the environment. And today we kind of see this among some people because you read about them every once in a while. They bring a tiger into their house, they have it for a pet, and they're surprised when the tiger eats Junior. Well, guess what? Taking a tiger into your house is not going to change it into a domestic cat. It's still a tiger. It's a large predator, and Junior is just a nice, defenseless piece of lunch. Now, notice Buffon's ideas were popular among educated people. And one of the reasons they were popular is really the same reason that some other early ideas about evolution were popular is they talked about change, they talked about special creation by God, and they kind of married the two ideas together. And like most people who proposed ideas about evolution, Buffon was actually a religious person. Now, after Buffon, the next person who had a big impact on ideas about evolution was another Frenchman, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, and he published a book called Philosophy of Zoology in 1809. And he believed there was a scale of natural complexity. You could almost think it looked like a ladder. At the bottom of the ladder, he put things called infusoria. Today, we don't really have a group called infusoria, but basically this was microscopic organisms. And after microscopic organisms, then if you took another step up the ladder, we had jellyfish. Then if you took another step up the ladder, you had worms. Then the next step was insects, then mollusks, which are things like clams and oysters and squids. And then finally, at the top step of the ladder, you had vertebrates, things with a backbone, which of course includes humans. And he thought that as you went up this ladder, from infusoria to jellyfish to worms to insects to mollusks to vertebrates, these organisms got more and more complicated. So he believed that living organisms could actually change during their lifetime from simple animals into more complex animals. So you might start out your life as a worm, but you could work your way up to being an insect during your lifetime, kind of like getting a promotion at work, if you want to think of it that way. And he had two basic ideas that guided this. Something called the complexifying principle, which pushed animals up the scale, and something called the adaptive principle. And this moved animals up the scale because of the way that they interacted with the environment. Now notice today, Lamarck is mostly remembered for one of his mistakes, something that he called his law of inheritance of acquired characteristics. And the law of inheritance of acquired characteristics basically says that things that you acquire during your lifetime can be passed down to your children. So if you go to the gym a lot, if you work out and you develop big muscles, your children will be born with big muscles. If you spend a semester in France and you learn to speak French, your children will be able to speak French. So living organisms are moving up this scale. So why don't we run out of things at the bottom of the scale? Because he believed that infusoria and worms and other simple types of living organisms, it should say simple animals, they're created by something called spontaneous generation. And spontaneous generation really just meant that living organisms could be produced out of nothing. In one document from the time, there's a recipe for how to make mice. If you want to make mice, take a pile of dirty laundry, throw it into your corner of your basement, put in some old stale bread crust, and if you come back in a couple of weeks, you'll have mice running around your pile of dirty laundry. Well, it might be that you created mice from bread crust and dirty laundry, but maybe another explanation is mice got into your basement, found a nice warm place, found some food, and started breeding there. Notice one problem with both Lamarck and Buffon is they don't really have a hypothesis that we can test and verify in an experiment. And remember, we said back at the beginning of Biology 105, this is one of the crucial things for something to be scientific. We have to have a hypothesis that we can test in an experiment and we can disprove in an experiment. And that was something that Lamarck and Buffon didn't have. So tomorrow we'll talk a little bit about Charles Darwin, and we'll start considering how we're going to look at evolution from a more modern perspective. And keep in mind that Darwin proposed the basic ideas about evolution that we accept today in 1859, so 170 years ago. So even though we still accept most of Darwin's basic ideas, there was a lot he didn't know about. In 1859, nobody knew that DNA was the genetic material. So until then, enjoy the rest of the day, and I will see you tomorrow. Don't forget to fill out the note card and send it back if you haven't done that yet. And have a good day. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them now. Interrupt during lecture if you want to. I know some teachers don't like being interrupted, but I don't have a problem with that. But if not, you're free to go, and I will talk to you tomorrow at the same time. So again, I'll send you an invitation via email and put one on the website so that if you can't get to one of those, hopefully the other one will allow you to get to the class. So bye-bye and stay safe today.
I have a question about archaea.
Sure.
So they have metabolic processes similar to eukaryotic cells.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Well, when we look at certain of the processes, like if you remember, protein synthesis has two steps. Translation, where we take the DNA and make messenger RNA, and then transcription, where we take the messenger RNA and we make protein. And transcription is actually more similar to what we see in eukaryotic cells than in prokaryotic cells. So we'll look at some other examples of that. But actually, if we go back to that chart we had at the first, notice how when we look at this chart, this shows that bacteria branch over to the left, and then archaea and eukarya both go over to the right. Even though they have prokaryotic cells, archaea are generally considered to be more closely related to eukaryotes than to bacteria. And that's because there are so many metabolic similarities, and we're actually discovering some archaea. We'll talk later, but archaea are very difficult to find in general. And we're actually discovering some archaea that have what look like the beginning of membrane-bound organelles. They're not quite membrane-bound organelles, but they're kind of partway there.
Okay, thanks. So they're kind of like proto-eukarya.
Yeah, that would be one way to think of them, as long as you don't think that, they have a goal to become eukaryotes. They're evolving in their own directions, and they just happen to have some similarities.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions or comments? Okay, if not, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and I'll quit recording. And as I say, this will be posted later. So if you need to come back to this, you're welcome to come back and look at this again, particularly when we get to the questions over evolution. As I mentioned, you'll find the answers to some of the questions in the Zoom sessions, as well as in the notes and the textbook. That'll be our three main sources for answering our questions.